Of all the survival foods in your stockpile, this is the one item that will give you the most nutrition, the most calories, and is the only one that on its own can keep you going for years on end. Today's video is all about pemmican. We'll guide you through the step-by-step process, explore its uses and variations, and show you how to store it in your stockpile shelf. Really, if you have pemmican, you technically don't need any other food source. Anything else you have stowed away is just going to be for convenience at that point. If there's one skill you need to learn involving prepping, it's how to make pemmican. There are few skills as critically important as this. So listen up, and let's get into it. Back in the day, indigenous North Americans made pemmican with buffalo or bison because they're such big animals. A single buffalo can easily produce 60 pounds of pemmican at the very least. So what makes pemmican so special that it can sustain you completely and keep you totally healthy? Well, let's look at the nutritional breakdown of the finished product. For every 100 grams, you'll get 600 calories, 26 grams of protein, 52 grams of fat, and 0 carbohydrates. That's enough energy per cup to get you through a day. And for the health-conscious folk, no carbs at all. Furthermore, it's got decent amounts of iron, calcium, magnesium, phosphorus, potassium, zinc, and B12. There is no other single food source that, on its own, carries this many nutrients. The oldest edible sample ever found was about 50 years old. So you'll be able to store it for a lifetime and then some. You can eat pemmican and only pemmican for years without any discernible negative effects on your health. Ingredients. Pemmican only requires 2 ingredients and 3 steps. Meat and fat is all you need. We don't have access to buffalo, but don't worry. You can substitute with any game animal, beef, and if you have enough of them, even with duck. As long as you have equal amounts of both fat and meat, you're good to go. There's no need for measuring cups for this to work. Secondly, the fat doesn't have to be from a specific part of the body. You're gonna render it down anyway. But if you have the choice, suet is the best fat to use. Suet is the fatty layer around the kidneys, and it's the most nutritionally dense and the cleanest on the whole carcass. Before we get into the business of making pemmican, why don't you take a moment to like and subscribe to the channel. This video came at the request of viewers, and if you have a suggestion or topic that you're curious about, we'll be happy to take a look into it. So please, don't hesitate to leave a suggestion for us in the comments. And now, back to actually making pemmican. Step 1. Drying the meat. First, you're going to start the process by drying the meat. It's preferable that you take the leanest cuts on the animal to keep the fat to an absolute minimum. The 2 ingredients need to be prepared separately before they're combined, so keep that meat as lean as possible. As long as the meat is cut into thin strips and bone dry after drying it, you can dry it with any method. You can air dry, smoke dry for that extra smoky flavor, dehydrate, or even use cold smoke. It doesn't really matter how, it just needs to be dry enough that you can snap it like a twig by the end. Then, you're going to take all of those brittle strips and put it through a blender to turn it into meat powder. You can grind it down with a mortar and pestle, but the effort is so great that it's just easier to go out and get a cheap blender to bring hours and hours of work down to just minutes. Once you've powdered however much meat you've prepared, set it aside for the time being, because you need to prepare the fat now. Step 2. Rendering the fat. Take approximately the same amount of fat as the powdered meat. You're welcome to weigh it, but eyeballing it works just as well. This isn't culinary school, and you're not making a croissant, so there's no need to be absolutely exact here. Now add your fat to a pot. No water, no oil, just the plain fat at a low heat on the stove. Fat melts into liquid at low temperatures, but it'll fry like a French fry if the heat's too high. Slow and consistent stirring to keep it from frying at the bottom does the trick. Even if it's a big pot and a lot of fat, it'll take 2 hours at most for it to melt into liquid. It should have a clear golden yellow color to it when everything's melted down. Throw the fluid through a strainer to get rid of any solid bits and leave that to cool down slightly. You want to time this part just right. If it cools off completely, it'll turn white and solidify hard, and then you'll have to heat it up all over again. You need it to be warm enough to still remain liquid, but cool enough that you can stick your finger into it without burning yourself. Step 3. Combine. Now it's time to combine the two. In a bowl, pour in your rendered fat into the meat powder, stirring and mixing as you go. You need it to form a clay-like consistency. You know it's right if you scoop out a handful and press it into a patty in your hand. If it retains its shape, it's perfect. If it falls apart, you need more fat. Once it reaches that moldable consistency, press the lot down into a pan. You can use anything you want here really, it just depends on what shape you want your pemmican to solidify into. Press it down with your hands and compact it tight. Set it in a cool place for 2 to 3 hours and the fat will cool, making that block completely solid. It'll still be soft enough to cut into shapes with a knife, but the fat will have sealed everything in tight, just like a vacuum sealer. Now, there are some ways to spruce it up and add some tasty things to it, but we'll get into those in just a second. But fat, meat, a little heat, and something to let it sit in is all it takes to create the world's oldest and most effective superfood. It really is that simple. Storing. You're probably wondering how to store all of your valuable blocks of sustenance now. Back in the day, it was wrapped in animal skins, but you don't have to do that. Wrap it in brown paper, freeze it, put it in glass jars or plastic containers. As long as the area is cool, dry, and out of direct sunlight, it'll store for years. Personally, we prefer vacuum sealing it. It's just the best way to transport an item that's airtight and would otherwise attract scavengers or bugs if you're out in the wilderness. Vacuum sealing locks in the smell, and it stores it for the longest of all the options. Freezing isn't ideal if you want it to last longer than a year. Any more than that, and freezer burn will begin to destroy your stock. Alternatives. Finally, it doesn't need to be made completely plain. Though once you add spices and berries to it, it'll only keep as long as the item you put in there can last. But it can still be worth the trouble of adding a little flair to it, because pemmican on its own is very hearty and filling, but it can be somewhat bland. But with the right mixes, you might just find yourself making it as a permanent food source as well as an emergency ration. Spices and herbs like coriander, salt, chilies, and cilantro will still keep for a good 5 years. Tart sweet berries will last for 3 years, and nuts will keep for a year. Just make sure that any ingredients you add are completely dried and devoid of all moisture. The sweeter varieties like the peaches and cranberries with some nuts added for crunch are the tastiest for plain eating, and the savory mixes are best for cooking. You don't need to cook pemmican, it's usually just eaten right out of the bag. But it's a popular addition to add to a pot of boiling water, along with all the things you foraged throughout the day thrown in there for a heavy stew filled with flavor. The final addition is grains. They last the longest of all, with 6 years at the very least on the shelf if they've been dried. If you're dying of scurvy or starvation, your gun and your tent isn't going to mean much to you anyway. Storing food for the long term isn't optional, it's utterly crucial. So why not make the one food that'll last the longest and feed you the most balanced diet? Get going now. Before you know it, the tomorrow that we're preparing for is going to come, and then it might just be too late. Until next time, get storing and get prepared the best you can. Besides, you might find that you enjoy the process of making pemmican as well as eating the final product so satisfying that you end up making more of it than you have space for. Hey, if you liked this video, please like and subscribe. This is Threat to Survival. Prepare today, thrive tomorrow. Embrace the threat to survival.